Today, of course, we want to buckle down and we look at what is happening as far as global affairs is concerned. With prayers, flowers, and flags draped in black ribbons, Japan said their farewell to Shinzo Abe, a polarizing figure who dominated politics as the country's longest-serving premier, before being gunned down at a campaign rally last week. Crowds packed pavements lined with heavy police presence as the hearse carrying Abe, who died at age 67, departed from a central Tokyo temple on a procession through the city. With nearly a dozen helicopters circling overhead, people bowed deeply, their hands clasped in prayer, as the hearse passed in a procession carried live on broadcaster NHK. Others clapped, cheered, or waved. Hundreds had filed into the temple where Abe's funeral was held on Monday evening and Tuesday morning prior to the private ceremony to pay their respects. His killing on Friday by an unemployed man wielding a homemade gun stunned a nation where both gun crime and political violence are extremely rare. The funeral procession passed through the capital's political heart of Nagatacho, where hundreds had lined up in front of a parliament building. Abe first entered as a young lawmaker in 1993 after the death of his politician father, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, and a group of cabinet ministers waited quietly in front of the office from which Abe, Japan's youngest prime minister, when he first took office, led the nation for 2 stints, the longest from 2012 to 2020 when he resigned due to health problems. Let's just listen in. To just remember the lifetime of Abe and his gunning, of course, I want to just cross over to Professor Naomi Damba to pick up on that. And Adali also promised that you will weigh in on the amnesty report as well, just briefly. Let's just begin with that, then we continue with Abe. Professor Naomi Damba.
Duval, what has just happened in Japan and is a shock not only for the people of Japan, and I want to convey my condolence to his family, particularly his wife, that I met when I went on a mission to sign an agreement with the university in Japan, and I happened to also greet the Prime Minister at that particular time, and he indicated to me that during his time, Africa universities and Japanese university will begin to work realistically, very close together. He had a plan for Africa, a realistic plan, listening to the leaders of Africa, the African people. He is very concerned that Africa has been cycled by the West and also the East to begin to do exactly the same thing that has happened to Africa for a long time. And he wanted a realistic plan coming out of Africa in terms of a proposal by universities and governments to Japanese, so that we can work in tandem, in partnership toward the realistic development of this continent. This kind of thing usually don't happen in Japan. It has happened, so there is no world Duval that is safe, and so we convey our condolence. Duval, with regard to what was the first thing you were asking?
Amnesty International report.
Yeah, here's what I want to say about that. Everything that happened does not happen in isolation. The country, the president, the leadership has to be compared with the rest. And I just remember Duval during the Moi era, when they were stepping on top of people's head and beating them with rungus and doing everything. The next door in Uganda, they're doing some horrible things in terms of human rights and everything. And we are a young democracy. Every life matters. And I congratulate our colleagues like Irungu and the rest in terms of the kind of work they do. Sometimes it's risky, but it is very important that these things be reported directly to Kenyan in terms of our status. It is important that we make our leaders accountable such that we can have a society that not only respect human life, but the sanctity of human life, and also respect the constitution that we have. All I know about, when I look at statistics, I look at how we stack against Africa, and then how we stack against the world. And the trend is that we're doing better. There is a positive trend in terms of how we're doing compared with the rest of Africa, and also how we're doing in the rest of the world. The three departments of government, the judiciary, the legislative, the executive, have to work together in order for us to become better.
Indeed. Thank you. All right, Dr. Hassan Kadenje.
I think, the death on the assassination, not really just the death of Shinzo Abe, it's of course shocking. I think it takes us back to the years of the 20s and the 30s when that thing was commonplace in Japan. I think the most recent was way back in 2006 when the mayor of Nagasaki was assassinated in the process for whatever reasons they were. But I think Shinzo is going to be remembered as perhaps in the modern Japanese history as a liberal internationalist who was also a realist. And the reason I'm saying that because he made a lot of Japanese people uncomfortable, some who viewed his kind of revising Japanese policy on self-defense that had been largely a very pacifist society by changing it to ensure that Japan achieves some degree of offensive capability, even though they're calling it defense. But also so Japan actually get involved outside its own sphere of influence, outside the Japanese territory, in alliance especially with the United States, and providing certain support, especially in US-led wars. And so he's moved fundamentally, Japan, to a place actually now where it's becoming more internationalist. But from us, those of us who are analysts, we're looking at it as more realist, especially in the wake of the kind of region that, of course, Japan finds itself in. You cannot outsource your security permanently ad infinitum. As a nation, you always have to find a way to defend yourself. But also that created a lot of controversy, it created a lot of enmity, and of course it made him perhaps one of the most polarizing figures, even though for the much of the world, it enhanced Japanese image, it increased Japanese involvement, and I think it has changed the trajectory of Japan, especially when it comes to international relations, I think for years to come.
And he can be also remembered for, lifting the country out of the deflation that was there. The moniker Abenomics can be also, tagged alongside Shinzo Abe, even on his deathbed.
It's true. One must acknowledge that Japan has its own Kennedy moment, the JF Kennedy assassination. The weight and bitterness within society that has not seen this kind of violence against this leadership is really a wake-up call to Japan, which has been more or less, foundationed on the Buddhist kind of morality, where leaders basically are treated with more respect than what we've seen. But that said, I think Abe has immortalized his own, himself into the Japanese history. First, because of what my colleague Kanenja has said, that no country can, outsource its security responsibilities for eternity. And this is what Abe was saying, that Japan must take charge of its own security, even though the Americans are still defending it, or have this security arrangement. So pushing that envelope was very, very important. And for the first time, we see Japan building, having a military base outside Japan and in our neighborhood, in Djibouti. So we have a Japanese military camp there. Japan taking more active role in peacekeeping globally, and also contributing widely to security activities across the group. As you've indicated, Abenomics,
yes,
which is basically a liberal reading of Japan's revival. And his government invited me to Japan. I must put this on record as a guest of the state. And I was given a full tour of the country from the north to south, and you could feel the air of, which was there. Yes, you can call him a populist, but was a populist within the context of Japanese culture. You never saw raptures as you would see in America, or as you would see elsewhere, where populists are in power. In fact, when you listing populists of our times, Abe doesn't come out, I guess because of the Buddhist tradition. But he was, a populist and helped to revive the Japanese economy. That's what he is remembered for. But for me as an African, I think Abe is more important in terms of establishing relations consolidated relations between Japan and Africa. Yes. Nairobi specifically became the host for TICAD, the TICAD summit here, and they co-hosted it with President Kenyatta, which was a great respect to us. And one of our own, Amina Mohammed, was honored by Japan for great performance in consolidating Kenya-Japan relations. And as I said, I, among others, have toured Japan as part of that relations, and I'm very proud and happy with them. I think what I can say to the Japanese people is Yokuo, Aish, Shimashwo, fare thee well, Abe. That is Japanese, if you didn't get it. And
you can repeat it again.
Yes. You say Yokuo, Ai.
Yokuo, Ai.
Shimashwo.
Shimashwo.
Yeah. Fare thee well. Shinzo Abe.
Okay.
He surely wears many hats.
Surely, yes, it does. It does.
Actually,
yeah. Before Hashi, yeah, but there is a very also interesting article. If you look at the current New Times in Rwanda, then we come to you, Hashi. This is the New Times in Rwanda, and we have a former finance minister there. That is on page 6. Can I just flip over there? He's paid tribute and written about what you're talking about, actually, the JF Kennedy moment there. This is Abe Shinzo's unmatched legacy, and this is, the writer is a former Japanese Deputy Vice Minister of Finance. He's a professor at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. And he says the assassination of former Japanese Prime Minister Abe Shinzo is sad, as it is shocking. Gun violence is exceedingly rare in Japan, and it seems clear already that both the Nara local police and the security police, that is the Secret Service, were ill-prepared to protect him. For Japanese of my generation, the tragedy calls to mind US President John F. Kennedy assassination in 1963 and the attempted assassination of Abe's grandfather, Japanese Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi, who was stabbed in 1960 after his government overcame parliamentary resistance to secure passage of the US-Japan Security Treaty. Under that agreement, the United States committed to providing a security umbrella over Japanese territory in exchange for Japan hosting US land, air, and sea bases. It was a treaty between unequal friends, and one of Abe's major accomplishments was to develop a more balanced bilateral relationship. Just briefly there.
The question here is the history of Japan. Before I get into that, there's the issue of the crime itself. The person who assassinated the prime minister, mothers went bankrupt. His mother went bankrupt, and she belonged to a South Korean church.
Yes.
Which is a massive church in that area, South Korea and in Japan, in which the Japanese and the Koreans belong to. It's an evangelical church. So she gave her money to the church and she went bankrupt. And the family collapsed And then this young man felt that Mr. Abe, who belonged to the same church, was responsible for the breakdown of his family. And that's why he assassinated him. But from the ideological and historical point of view, Debal, Mr. Abe represented the faction in Japanese society that were paying homage to the imperial history of Japan. They were the equivalent of the, I cannot say the Donald Trumps, but the far-right Republican wing in Japan. And they believed that the Japanese had gone two-way to the left and become peaceniks and gave up their security concerns to the United States. And in that way, the Japanese economy really flourished because they were not spending any money on defense. However, the Japanese did not have any, wherewithal in international relations from the point of view of the military. As my colleague here was just saying, they've got a foothold now in Djibouti. And I think that's the existential question that keeps coming up it's a recurrent theme in Japanese history. Should we go and change the constitution that tells us that Japan cannot militarize its society anymore? Japan cannot have defense forces. Japan cannot have offensive weapons. After the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Debal, you remember that the shrine, there's a shrine in Tokyo, I think it's in Tokyo, which is full of those fellows who had invaded China. People forget what Japan did in the Second World War, Debal. They overran Asia, all the way to Manchuria, to Singapore, to Burma, and they were just about to enter India. And if they had entered India, they would have gone to the Middle East. There was a massive loss of life in the Pacific War, and most of it was Japanese. Of course, you know that the United States bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki to show the Soviet Union that they had an atomic bomb. They did not bomb Japan because there was going to be a loss of life. The Japanese military basically crumbled, and they would have just taken it over. So the point I'm trying to make, Debal, is Mr. Abe is a representative of the right wing, a representative of the feelings of empire of Japan, a representative of trickle-down economics. Abenomics is about trickle-down economics. It's a Reaganite type of economics. I firmly believe, Debal, that that's a wake-up call for the Japanese people. And probably they need to have a debate about what they should do with their constitution. But I want to offer my condolences. And in Japanese, I want to say, Okuyami Moshigamasu. We wish him well.
Right. Seems I'll be working also on my Japanese a little bit here. Let's hear from Irungu Houghton and also Professor Noami Damba.
So I have also had the opportunity of being in Japan, and there are kind of 2 or 3 key values of the Japanese people. There's compassion, there's a sense of order and respect for order and life, and for elders and family. And this, it remains to be seen whether this is an isolated incident or the beginnings of a spike in terms of intolerance and extremism within Japanese society. But I think we can only but start by just condemning the killing of this leader, and particularly that it happened during an electoral moment, which should not be lost for those of us in Kenya as we go through our electoral moment. Political extremism is probably the most dangerous trend in an election season. So I think the Archbishop of Tokyo spoke, I think, very powerfully on this, and he said, violence kills democracy, it kills freedom, it kills justice. And I think what we have to look at is how do we consolidate democracies across the world so that people are able to have disagreements, even on policy, but it does not lead to a loss of life. I mean, I think we had a moment very, very different from the killing of Shinto, but we had a moment during the funeral of the late President Kibaki when a young man approached the dais within walking distance of the President of the Republic, and Archbishop Muheria, the Catholic Archbishop, essentially de-escalated the situation with a level of decorum and care and compassion And if you remember, he said as the man was being taken away by the security services, please, he is a son of the soil, he is the son of the nation, please take care of him. We have to find ways of ensuring that people who are struggling with mental health issues or maybe struggling with extremism, that they are brought back into a culture that does not lead to loss of life. So I think, you know, that for me is one of the things that came through. I don't have a Japanese quote, but perhaps Noah Midambo will give us one.
I would love to hear from Noah Midambo a quote from you as well. Yep.
I'm not going to offer my quote. Those two people have represented as well.
Okay.
Dubal, I think my colleagues have stated it right. Abe is going to be known for a number of things. One is he was more leaning toward the right, and agree with Hashi about that. But it was much more realistic about Japanese role and Japanese future, particularly with regard to Africa and the rest of the developing country. He felt that Japan should not use its position, its economy, its power to continue to exploit Africa the way they have done. He encouraged Japanese motors, Japanese companies to invest more in Africa and also be co-manufacturer. For instance, Honda, Toyota, to be manufacturing and train the people. He did a number of innovative, as a result of that. There is a lot of, a number of innovative programs that involve Japanese companies and Kenya companies that are going on. There's a lot of relationship between the universities. You know, particularly my university signed an agreement where we have an exchange program with the Japanese premier university, where our students go to Japan, and for the first 2 years they learn about Japanese, and then they come back here and teach and do other things. And Japanese do the same thing. They come to Kenya, learn Kiswahili, understand fundamental culture, then they go to Japan and do the same thing. So it was really realistic. It was more of middle ground than the extremely right, the Reagan type. And I remember him and shaking his hand and listening to him was wonderful.
Right. Many thanks indeed, Noah Midambo. I think we wind up on that, unless you have something else that you want to put on. Professor Noah Midambo, thank you for that particular comment. Sri Lanka President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has fled the country early today, according to news sources, hours before he was due to step down amid widespread protests over his handling of a devastating economic crisis. Rajapaksa, his wife and 2 bodyguards left aboard a Sri Lanka Air Force plane, according to an immigration official. A government source said he left for the city of Male, the capital of Maldives. The president will most likely proceed to another Asian country from there, according to the source. The immigration official said authorities could not and law prevent a sitting president from leaving the country. Rajapaksa was due to step down as president today to make way for a unity government after thousands of protesters stormed his and the prime minister's official residences on Saturday, demanding their ouster. The president has not been seen in public since Friday. Parliament will elect his replacement on July the 20th. The Rajapaksa's family, including former Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, has dominated the politics of the country of 22 million for years, and most Sri Lankans blame them for current problems. We can just listen into some of course, these are the protesters you can see there on your screen, and we can just listen in to also how they were thronging the Prime Minister's residence. just look at that aerial view, this is how people were storming, so to speak, the residence of the Prime Minister. People are tired, they're hungry, and this is what really happens when, you know, push really comes to shove as far as the cost of living is concerned. Professor Kagwanja.
I think it's very sad that we've got leadership have to get to this. It's very sad that you have to be ejected out of office in this kind of a manner. But I think for many of us, it's a wake-up call to many governments, because it's one thing to talk about your record, but it's another thing to listen to what the people are saying about that record. If you ask him, he will tell you he was doing very well in terms of his performance. But in one of our sources, for this particular program, you saw the way he soared Sri Lanka's debt, meaning that, like, for example, the borrowing from the market, open market, is 47% and so on, and the whole debt was completely out of control. I know Sri Lanka has been used as an example of how, of what has been called the Chinese takeover through the debt trap. Obviously, that's a false narrative, because the World Bank and others, and borrowing from the market is wider. But the burden that he had put on the Sri Lanka people is heavy, and therefore his going is a relief. It's an indication that people are still determined to deal with the cronyism and state capture and so on, and the public itself will take charge. The governments don't have, the successors don't have to do this. They just need to do what is right. For us in Kenya, I think it's a wake-up call to Raila Odinga and Martha Karua and the team that should they take over power, they have to really lessen the burden on the people. Because if they don't, I cannot see this scenario, not being very, very absent in Kenya. Because we almost the same realm in terms of the debt issue, and in terms of the economic performance. Yeah, infrastructure we've done well. We have done well in health. We have done well, but at the bottom line is whether we are able to meet our needs. And Sri Lanka is a wake-up call for the incoming administration, whoever is coming in, to ensure that we don't have to have the Sudanese, the Sri Lankan, and the Egyptian scenario where people pour out to do, because it's not a solution. It's not a solution. It's not a solution. The solution is for the government to reform within, and I'm happy that the Azimio government is committing itself to reform. Even Kenya Kwanza government is committing itself to reform, but reform is a way out of this situation.
Indeed. Amadashi? No, I haven't heard from Irungu Houghton. We'll come to you, sorry. We'll come to you. Irungu Houghton, I think I lost you in the shuffle. Are you still there?
I am here. I hope you can hear me.
I can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So, just very dramatic scenes from Sri Lanka at the moment. And of course, it's been brewing for several months. As Amnesty International, we have spoken out publicly on a number of occasions, reminding the authorities that people have the right to protest, of course, non-violently, and that the continued escalation of violence to stop the protests will lead to the violence. And I think this is what we've seen. 4 months ago, we spoke about the beatings of journalists. We spoke about the arrests of organizers. And of course, now the state has lost control and is now really at the mercy of the people of Sri Lanka. And one would hope that, some level of sanity returns and the destruction of property and potential loss of life begins to reduce in the weeks going forward. I think there are a number of parallels for us. One is, of course, many countries, Kenya included, are going through an economic crisis at the moment. Food and fuel prices are unbearable for many of us. In the case of Sri Lanka, the crash was essentially not having enough foreign exchange to be able to manage the balance of trade payments, and therefore you started to see hardships beginning to increase dramatically. The second parallel for Kenya, really, as Kagwanja has talked about, is the debt burden. And $51 billion worth of debt is what Sri Lanka is dealing with, of which 10% is actually owed to China. So you can already see some of the, some of the parallels. I think the last one really is you know, I would probably say that for Kenya Kwanza, for for Azimio, for all the political parties that seek to run the national administration and the 47 county administrations, they have to really think carefully about how do they allow for dissent, how do they allow for people to be able to protest in a way that is peaceful, how do they channel those comments in a way that it actually generates new policy and gives guidance to those that govern, rather than begin to tear the economy apart and really threaten the rule of law and threaten governance as a whole. So I think those are the implications, I think, for us as Kenya, but very dramatic scenes, as we can see. I mean, maybe I can just one last anecdote which our viewers maybe find interesting. So I had an opportunity it's about 10 years ago, speaking to the Tunisian Minister of Tourism and Statistics. And of course, those two are not often together in one portfolio. But in Tunisia, just before the revolution, there was a minister for tourism and statistics. And I asked him, after he praised the GDP and the growth rates of Tunisia just before the revolution, I said to him, if the GDP growth was so great, why were you ushered unceremoniously out of government? And he said, well, it's probably the case that the people on the streets were not reading our economic surveys. They weren't reading our economic reports. And I think there is a lesson there for people in power.
I love that.
The Bali, our colleague Irungu put it so well.
Yes.
Misreading the people and understanding where the people are coming from is one of the biggest mistake any leader can do for any country. This was coming, Dubal, when you look at the trend and statistic, their death burden, the anxiety among the people, from food to everything else. And it was expected that it will be much more violent than what we are seeing. And it's good that the leadership left, because for them to stay one more day was going to be much more brutal than what we are seeing. And so good luck to the country. They have to redraw their goals again and begin refocusing, particularly managing Chinese debt and all other outside debt that they have.
Mm-hmm. Right. Hamid Hashim.
You know, the great George Bernard Shaw, probably one of my favorite authors, said, life is not about finding yourself, it's about creating yourself. Not about finding yourself, but creating yourself. So I find this quip to be very, very germane to the Sri Lanka situation. And I'll tell you why, Deval. Do you know the Rajapaksas, Deval, got rid of about 30 years of an insurgent movement in Sri Lanka called the Tamil Tigers, with the help of Chinese artillery. They bombed northern Sri Lanka, particularly Jaffna and its region, kilometer by kilometer until they destroyed the Tamil. And they went into government with a wave of popularity. You know, they've got the same ethnic problems that we have here between the Sinhala and the Tamil community. We got independence at the same time. The economy and us, we are there an English colony. We have very strong similarities between Sri Lanka. Mm-hmm. Now, what the president there did, Rajapaksa, is appointed his brother prime minister, he appointed his son finance minister, mm-hmm. he appointed his brother's son minister for economics, he appointed the other one as vice president. The whole family was in government. So, mm-hmm. Debal, you know what happened was political incest. Mm-hmm. It was incest. And once you sit in a room as a family and you have the instruments of a state, you're bound to make a mistake, because all you're going to do is try and do something called corruption. So what happened, Debal, is that they completely mismanaged this place. You know, there's something called a current account in economics. So you know that current account is what buys things from the outside. So if you want to buy oil, you've got dollars in a current account, and you have to buy a certain... They couldn't buy food, they couldn't buy oil, they couldn't buy mosquito coils, they couldn't buy anything. And instead of looking for innovative ways to deal with this, the family went into their state house and closed themselves, insulated themselves from the people. This is a very, very, very important lesson for us in Kenya to learn. is that it takes a little bit of a spark. Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi always said he would go to Kibra every evening. You know, he had a house there. He put his dipstick in Kibra to go and find out if people were eating, if people had unga, if people were okay. If people had money during Moi's time in their pocket. There was nothing that was working. But everybody went home and they could have their ugali sukuma wiki and a bit of kuku or a bit of nyama. We have built infrastructure, we have built them this, we have built that. But I want to ask the people of Kenya, do you have money in your pocket? Were you better off 4 years ago than you are not better off today? It is very important for us to bring in a progressive movement into this country so that we can overhaul this 2 billion shilling a day corruption. Deba, 2 billion Kenyan shillings corruption. It could end poverty in maybe 10 counties in this country by tomorrow morning. The mismanagement that has been in the government over these issues of poverty and the people at the bottom is outrageous. Price here, unga cannot be over 200 shillings. You cannot even buy sukuma wiki and oil. We're not here to rule the infrastructure, even though it's important. We're here to make the lives of families and normal Kenyans better. And it must be better. And the new administration that's coming in the first 100 days has to prove to these Kenyans that food on the table is going to be affordable. And if it's not, the ball all bets are off. The people are going to do the same thing that the people of Sri Lanka have done.
Okay. Professor Kagwanja, this is also reminiscent of what before handshake was here in the country, where we had the boycott of some of the goods that were deemed to be, produced by a different quarter or different quarter of this particular country, and we had people threatening that also they'll go and storm State House. If this is what we're seeing here in Sri Lanka, would have been, transpolated into what would have happened before the handshake, where would we be as a country? Because also the cost of living was high, and everything ground to a halt until the handshake.
It's important to underline that the Sri Lanka protests are taking place against the backdrop of the socio-economic devastations brought by COVID-19 pandemic, and more recently the Russia-Ukraine war. Those two events have completely devastated the world. They say in countries that are advanced or industrialized, now they are at the verge and the brink of recession. Many of them are where they have never been before in terms of the economic background. Now you can begin to imagine what's happening to other countries. Now it is that context, therefore, we need to focus on what is happening to Kenya, for example, and what can we count as our blessing, and what can we count, what opportunities have we missed, and I think there is a balanced debate here that that Kenyans of the years have kind of come up with a culture whereby the country is more important than all of us, and therefore we do what is in the best interest of countries. And that's where the handshake outside the political context was such a game changer. It was a game changer. It is as if we knew that we are going to confront these two events, the COVID-19 and now the global crisis brought about by the war in Ukraine. And as you've rightly asked, had we had a continuous kind of showdown in protests in our streets, as we had from 2015. Because this protest started that early. 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017 was just a climax. 2018 was even worse because we had two presidents, quote unquote. One, the official president, and the other one, the people's president. What was coming of us would have easily become a banana republic. So that if COVID-19 caught us in that kind of a situation, if the Ukraine war caught us in that situation, that would have brought us down completely. So we tip our hats for our leadership both in the opposition and the government, particularly Prime Minister Raila Odinga and President Uhuru Kenyatta for that, because it provides a good context for us to respond. At the same time, there are missed opportunities in this camaraderie between Raila Odinga and Uhuru Kenyatta. From a democratic perspective per se, we lost the principle of checks and balances to the point that you have to be nice to your partner. Therefore, there were things that went unnoticed, and that's where we have seen the issues of economic misfortunes or woes. We have seen the debt, which we have already talked about, and many things we can count, which contribute to what my brother here is talking about: no money in the pockets. The balance between what we invest and what we eat, because that balance is very, very important. What we eat is what is in our pocket, and what we pride ourselves upon are the tarmac we walk on, the highways we drive, the aircrafts and we have, and all that. That's okay, but at the base of it is the living. Are we living well? Are we able to put a meal on the table, a roof over our head, dress for our children, and our children are going to school without so much strain? I think that's where we have, and I like Irongo's comment, because the leadership sometimes, for those of us who talk too much, because we in the government, we associated with the government, and at the same time we talk, people think we are irresponsible. We are not. If we don't speak the way we are speaking, you will not know. You'll think that it's the usual Irongos, Amnesty International, human rights people talking. It is not. We don't need to read the reports of growth, economic growth and all. We need to hear from the people what they are saying. That's the litmus test. That is the dipstick. It is not the report. And that's why Irongo's comment is very wise and on the mark.
Thank you. All right. Now, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson quit office, ending his less than 3-year stint in office. In a televised address, the Conservative politician described his now former post as the best job in the world, but acknowledged that nobody is indispensable in British politics. Though he resigned, the outgoing Prime Minister is expected to stay on until a successor is found. Let's just listen into what he has to say.
On the surface, it looks like a regular Thursday afternoon in the town of Oxbridge, where Boris Johnson has been representing as MP for 3 consecutive terms. But once you start speaking to the residents here, the true picture of today's resignation comes to full glare.
I think that the resignation has been a long time coming. It's something that I wanted to see happen. It's something that I think anyone with integrity would have done a long time ago.
He's been Prime Minister for 3 years. How do you think he's performed as Prime Minister?
Not as well as his party likes to portray him. He's now seen as this great world leader, apart from Ukraine, which he handled quite well. The rest of it, the whole of Europe, probably half the world, thought he was a clown.
Boris Johnson,
good afternoon, everybody,
stormed into the political sphere in the United Kingdom largely for being among the top proponents for the Brexit vote, leading a close contest that ultimately saw the UK leave the European Union in a referendum held in 2016. He took over office with high approval ratings that same year, and in 2019 led the Conservative Party to the highest vote confidence since Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. But 68-year-old Judith Baburi says even that wasn't enough, especially after 1 year ago the Partygate scandal emerged, which saw members of 10 Downing Street hold 2 controversial parties at a time when the United Kingdom was in lockdown.
He's just not right for the job. He's just not right for the job, and I'm sorry to say, I'm pleased he's gone, because we need somebody that's for the people in England.
The United Kingdom has been struggling with the worst inflation witnessed here in years. Economists say it's the worst of any European country at the moment. According to research firm GfK, GDP fell by 0.3% in April this year, following a 0.1% contraction in March. For the first time since the national lockdown of January 2021, all three of the UK's main sectors, services, industrial production and construction, registered falls in the latest data.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Much of the decline attributed to Boris Johnson's leadership.
He has been wrong on so many things and has completely put the public aside to the point right now where there's a cost of living crisis, there's a housing crisis. Every industry in the country is and it's all down to him. Sorry for swearing.
Many of those whom we spoke to had little to no kind words to share about Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, and whether or not he retains his seat as MP if a snap election is ever held remains to be seen. And so, even as Boris Johnson formally steps down as the Conservative Party leader, he will likely remain in office as Prime Minister until a suitable replacement has been found. A process that, if stretched out long enough, could take up to 2 months. Timothy Otieno, KTN News in Uxbridge, London, the United Kingdom.
Our very own Timothy Otieno there for that comprehensive reporting. And looking at The Economist, you want also to pick up the copy of the latest Economist. The Economist is carrying out this, or had this particular, it has this particular head splash there, clown fall, Britain after Boris. And you can see the way he's fallen mightily there. And tucked away inside is a story of Boris Johnson. It says character in politics, and they're saying that the party will hope that its agony is now drawing to a close. But that depends on it taking the right lessons from Mr. Johnson's failure. One is about character in politics. Mr. Johnson rejected the notion that that to govern is to choose. He lacked the moral fiber to take hard decisions for the national good if that threatened his own popularity. He also lacked the constancy and the grasp of details to see policies through. And he reveled in trampling rules and conventions. At the root of his style was an unshakable faith in his ability to get out of scrapes by spinning words. In a corner, Mr. Johnson will charm, temporize, prevaricate, and lie outright. Occasionally, he apologized. As a result, the bright spots in his record, such as the procurement of vaccines against COVID-19 and support for Ukraine, were overwhelmed by scandal elsewhere. Behind the unfolding drama was a void where there should have been a vision. Crises were not a distraction from the business of government. They became the business of government. As the scandals mounted, so did the lies. Eventually, nothing much was left. That is inside The Economist for you. If you go to page, this is it there, that is on page 9 of The Economist. But I want just to cross over to Noah Midamba to comment on this as well. Noah Midamba, what some of the lessons can we draw, especially when you're talking about character in politics and how important character is?
Duval, allow me to look at it from another angle. We'll talk about character later. This is called a global political pendulum. Pendulums seem to swing every 2 decades from left to right. And people like Professor Munene and others have done a lot of work in this area. And basically what we're beginning to see is the beginning of the end of the right-wing movement. And such that pendulum will move back to the middle and then move to the left at the end. And so we are seeing the end of people like Trump, the way you look at him, Brazil president, Erdogan in Turkey, those sort of extreme people, and then Boris Johnson. And you can also include the president of Russia. They have reached their limit and that the people are speaking and are pushing back. And so is Johnson caught in the middle of that, or is it really his character? History will tell as we move from here. There were things that were very important for the British people, which he championed. There were Tories wanted out of European Union. They felt it's diminishing the British image, British power, and they've been on it for a long time. And this fellow came at the right time. Did he reach his peak? This is the end of it. Again, time is going to tell. But in America, as you can see, between Barack Obama, which consider left, and then Ronald Reagan was on the right. The time is swinging, and I think it's going to shift people like Johnson and others that are going to be coming after him leading the war.
Right, thank you. Ahmed Hashi.
I have never disagreed with my senior and my close personal friend, Mr. Professor Midamba. I've never disagreed with him. But I want to commend him to look at Tayyip Erdogan again, because I think that he's moved Turkey from a backward country and really taken it to new heights. But on this issue of the Prime Minister, Debal, the take on Clownfall is from the movie by director Sam Mendes, the 007 movie called Skyfall. Mm-hmm. That's where they get the turn of the name. Debal, the entire problem of the Great Britain is Brexit. It is the father, the mother, and the children of its political problems. Mm-hmm. This current Prime Minister was elected, Debal, on a single issue, and that single issue was Brexit. And the Conservative Party, Debal, played on the dark side of British life. You remember they said that the Africans were coming, that they were going to come through Morocco, and we were going to have 10 million Nigerians in London. That all the Eastern Europeans are going to come and take all the jobs away. And they stoke the fears of British society that has got this latent racism in its history and its in present. And that brought out the vote from Middle England, and it pushed the Conservative Party with a massive mandate into the Parliament, but nobody looked at nobody really paid attention to the leader there, who truly, Debal, did not deserve to be a Prime Minister in England. Mm-hmm. He's a very erratic man who was living on the dangerous side of right-wing British politics. Debal, he's called Africans very bad names. He's called Asians very bad names. He has been active in promoting hate in England. And Debal, it is, I'm surprised that it took this long to get rid of him. And what finally got rid of him is his antics, Debal. You know, during COVID, he went to a drinking party. During COVID, he gave the laws, and what he did was he did exactly the opposite. He reappointed a minister who was groping a man in a bar, and he promoted him. Debal, he is just terrible things that he has done, and he deserves it. And I'm surprised that he's still sitting in that office. And I hear the Labour government, the Labour opposition, is going to put a no confidence motion in the government. The Conservative Party, and I agree here absolutely with my senior, Mr. Midamba, we're seeing the end of the end, or the beginning of a new right-wing political party that understands social affairs. And I think this is the end of these Eton types who are in the right wing of England and who have caused a huge problem in Europe. And they're suffering economically now because they're not integrated into the European economy. They left, and when they left Debal, it means they became an island. And the United States, which is a great promoter of Brexit, the Americans want Britain out of out of Europe because they don't want a European Union which will become the biggest economy in the world if it's properly managed. Therefore, put to you, Debal, that for Kenya, this is good. We don't want the Whig party. We want the Labour Party to come back to power. Those are the guys we're happy to deal with.
Those are Hashish's comments as well. Let me just cross over to Irungu Houghton on this as well. And looking at the character in politics, what parallels can we draw from Boris Johnson on how not to lead?
Well, I mean, a couple of reflections really on Boris Johnson's departure from kind of the political stage. It's been 12 years since the Conservative Party have been running the UK. I often try to avoid ridiculing any human being, and particularly people who have exercised large, tremendous power, like a Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. I think in many ways he will be remembered in a couple of ways. The first is really that, he was first and foremost a populist. He was a right-wing populist and was very talented in the way that he campaigned for the issues that he thought were important. Like Donald Trump, was able to sway large numbers of the British people behind him. But I think, the more important point is that, we have seen a growing rise of kind of populism in Europe. I mean, I think something like autocratic states have doubled in the last 15 years, and 50% of those states are in Europe. And so I think we have to also see him as an expression of his time as well. But I think the other thing that I wanted to just kind of point out is that, despite his departure, we are still left with a number of policy issues that I think are questionable and should be challenged. Like, for example, does this mean that the immigration repatriation of refugees seeking asylum in the UK, is that program in partnership with Rwanda coming to an end? He was instrumental in creating this idea of an isolationist Britain and a departure from Brexit. We will see an opportunity for the British government to enter into a new relationship with the European Union. Will you see higher levels of integrity in terms of leadership? I mean, obviously he has been crashed on the basis of his personal integrity. But the question I would ask is really, do we see an opportunity for a kinder, more compassionate, more progressive Britain on human rights and social justice issues? And I think one other reflection just for Kenyans is, when the British people, when the Conservative Party picks its next leader, it will not do so on the basis of opinion polls. It will not do so on the basis of consensus. It will do so on the basis of elections by Conservative Party members. And I think there are lessons for our own democracy in terms of how do you create political parties that are able to democratically elect their leaders, even if they are right-wing populists. There is a process there that allows for the say of political party members rather than an elite that makes those decisions. So I think there are lots of lessons for Kenya.
Right, we want to take a short break. When we circle back, we shall hear from Professor Kagwanja, especially on the politics of fantasy. Is it was that the entree of Boris Johnson's, of course, leadership into the 10 Downing Street? This is the politics of fantasy, and you can trace it back to Brexit. Let's see some of his promises that he made, did they really come through at the end of the day? We take a short break.